Tēnā anō tātou. No mai hoki mai. Hopefully you had enough time to grab a decent cuppa and you've come back rearing to go. What a lot of people don't realise is last session we had a little bit of a technical glitch. So we're a bit slow getting some of the questions, but it's all sorted now. With that though, don't forget if you do have questions, fire them down the bottom in the live Q&A and we'll get to those at the end of each session. But you won't hear much more from me. I'll pass it on to Bridget for our next session. Bridget.
Hi, welcome back everybody. This session is on novel tools and strategies for predator-free 2050. There are so many different pest control options available and under development that it can be hard to choose the best approach for any given project. That's why the Novel Tools and Strategies Supporting Predator-Free 2050 research team is creating an online tool that will allow project managers to estimate what is achievable with the resources they have or what it will be likely to cost to achieve their eradication goals. By combining existing predator management models, cost data, and social and cultural preference data, the team will support projects to develop relative cost effectiveness rankings for different management options. And on that note, I would like to introduce Chris Jones as our first speaker, as a wildlife biologist who is based in Lincoln, who has worked on most of New Zealand's introduced predators. He is currently leading the Wildlife Management and Conservation Ecology Science portfolio at Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research, and will be speaking to us about cost efficacy in predator eradication programs. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Bridget. Kia ora tātou. Yeah, it sounds very exciting, doesn't it? Cost effectiveness of predator eradication. But in dealing with a lot of the predator-free projects, it's come up as an issue, and hopefully we can support projects to do things a little bit better going forward. Now, as many of you know, Predator-Free 2050, it's this ambitious goal that was set back in 2016 to get rid of some of the worst of our introduced mammalian predators, those being possums, mustelids, which some of you may know as ferrets, stoats and weasels, and rats by 2050. Now, there's been quite significant investment since the initiative started back in 2016. Over $300 million have already been directed to predator-free initiatives. And there was another, I believe, $64 million allocated in the most recent budget, with a commitment to ongoing funding beyond that. A company set up by the government, Predator-Free 2050 Limited, is investing in 17 very large landscape. Thank you. Yeah, there's a large number, 16 large regional landscape projects outside of conservation land that are funded to attempt to eradicate predators. I'm getting a lot of audio in the background, so please excuse me if I'm stumbling a bit. On top of that, there are hundreds of smaller scale local community-led projects around the country. Now, when a project is set up, they ask a number of questions, and they're all very, very common. Most of those are around how do we do it, and that's best practice. And hopefully that's something Jessi can address when she speaks a bit later. But also, they come up with the questions that Bridget alluded to earlier, and that's, can we afford to achieve our goals? What are your goals? If you look at all those traps and all those different bait stations and things that people can use, they all have a cost associated with them. Or what can we reasonably achieve given the funding we've got? These programs cost money, and there's been an element of invest first and let's see what happens. Now, I've phrased this as a return on conservation investment, because given the investment that we've done nationally in this initiative, Predator Free, there's probably very little other area of industry that would invest $300 million without assessing what the return on investment would be. And in conservation and pest management, we have to ask the question, do we do that adequately? And how can we better support projects to do that, so that they have some confidence that the money that they invest or their funders invest will actually achieve what they're hoping to achieve? Now, if you take any sort of project around eradicating predators, whether it's half of Taranaki or the local bush reserve, they've all got some things in common, and that's you come up with an idea, you come up with this dream, and you plan it, and you get funding for it. You might start off with funding and then decide what you're going to do. Or the more common way is we've got this plan that we want to do. Now we need to go and get some money, whether we go to DOC, whether we go to the Lotteries Commission or Predator Free or whatever. Once you've got that money, you then carry out operations. You do your monitoring, and you're either successful or you're not. How do you define success? That's another piece of research. But when you're doing the doing, you have to take things into account. Which tools do you use? What's best practice? Where are you going to do it? Which species are you going to target? All those things that you would consider when planning a predator control or eradication operation. That's going to have a cost. And that cost needs to be explicitly included in any sort of planning. How can we better support projects, programs, no matter how big, to incorporate costs more explicitly when thinking about what goals they want to achieve? Now, this is a fairly complex diagram, but basically it breaks the project down into 3 bits. Okay. The first one is this, what we've called an ecoeconomic model. Now, it's based on an existing, reasonably simple piece of software that allows users to define a trapping program or putting out base stations over an area of land and looking at, given the area, given the species they're targeting, given the habitat, given the number of traps, what is the likely reduction that they can achieve in the target population for that level of effort? What it doesn't incorporate yet, and what we're trying to do, is bring in costs. First of all, in assessing how much effort, and this is what's been done up until this project started, it depends on a number of factors: which species, how far they move, how many traps you've got, where you put them, how often you check them, all that sort of thing. That when it's modeled, and sorry to talk about models because they are fairly dry, you can get some sort of an idea of what you're likely to achieve with it. Now, if both of those panels have something in common, bottom left corner where my mouse is wiggling here, that's if you deploy a certain number of traps over an area targeted at a species, the model would predict you get this sort of decline in population. So for example, on the left, if you deploy 1,200 traps, given all the characteristics of the site and the species, it could bring your population size down to, say, in this simulation, 285 animals. It's a simulation, don't worry about the exact numbers. But if you multiply the number of traps times 4, so that's 4 times the effort, look at the effect on population size. It gets down almost to 0, almost to eradication. So what the existing software and the programming did and the modeling was to allow you to estimate, given this effort, what can we achieve? The next step, and the one that we're trying to do in this piece of work, is to ask how much will that cost? Because clearly, if you got $100 million, you could pretty much put a lot of effort in. But if you only had 50,000, could you do the same? And therefore, could you achieve your goals? Okay, for example, so now when we bring in costs into the model, this is the sort of output you get. Now, this is very, very beta version, if you like. The end version for communities won't be anywhere near this complicated. What we've got here are, if you put in certain parameters about the spacing of your traps, which is up here where I'm wiggling, how long you do it for, how frequently you check them, how much it costs to pay people to check them, what is the cost per trap. So for any designed program of trapping, bait stations, etc., you get a cost. Now, if you are setting up a project and you have a range of options, you can use kill traps, you can use live traps, you can use bait stations, etc., etc. You can compare both the effectiveness, if we remember the graphs in the previous slide about how much that predator population is likely to decline based on your effort, plus the cost it takes to do that. So users can then make a decision on the cost effectiveness of different approaches using this modeling method. So basically, we've got this, what we call the ecoeconomic model. It's based on existing software that we've now incorporated costs. So projects can rank their options in terms of what they do and how long they do it for by cost effectiveness. But it's really important to acknowledge that people make decisions based on more than just economics. The next bit of our program is looking at how people prioritize and rank the options for control based on other value sets, social and cultural values. Let's use an ultimate example. If you look at just the cost effectiveness metric, it might tell you that aerial 1080 is the most effective and cheapest way of doing something. But clearly, there are sections of society that have issues with that. Therefore, it isn't the top priority approach that you could use when designing your project. So the next steps, building on what we've done so far, is to develop a process so that communities, and when I say communities, that could be a local trust or group who are going to get rid of possums from their reserve to anything as large as predator-free Taranaki, how users can rank a range of likely eradication tools based on their value sets. We're then looking to incorporate those rankings into the cost effectiveness model so that people can see how their choices interact with cost effectiveness, and to give them a set of options based on all those values so that they can better choose, one, which tool to use, what it's going to cost, and what the likely effects are on that predator population for that investment. The final bit of the project is to bring it all together into a piece of software that will go online and that communities can use. Now, our ideal scenario for that is that we're going to work with communities to keep it real. So we will try iteratively different versions of the software with the pest control communities so that they can give us feedback so it is useful for their needs. Now, one of the questions we'll ask, for example, is there a threshold size of project below which these sort of questions are unimportant? If you've only got a few traps and you just want to go out and do something and feel good about it in your local patch of bush, do you really want to go through all this? At some point, there will be a level of investment that demands some sort of understanding of what you're likely to achieve. So that's one of the questions we're likely to ask communities that we work with. We're looking to do this with a series of case studies, some of which will be exclusively Maori-based projects, and some will just be projects of a range of sizes across the country so that we can trial the tool. And the eventual endpoint will be to find a user-friendly IT person to develop a user-friendly web app so that people can use it based on the level of input that they're comfortable with. So for a big program, for example, predator-free Taranaki, where you've got a lot of professional expertise, there's a level of detail that they could work with that a local community group may not want. They might just want it very basic. How much money have you got? Which species you're targeting? Which habitat? What sort of area? Here are your options. So given all that, we're hoping then that we can host it online with one of the major pest control initiatives, for example, Predator Free or the Predator Free Trust, hey Jessi, or somebody like that, so that people can link this planning and cost effectiveness tool with best practice knowledge so that they can design their projects and hopefully have a better chance of achieving their goals. I hope I haven't spoken for too long. Thank you for listening. That's my bit done.
Thanks, Chris. And we're going to move right along to hear from Dr. Ali Palmer, who's a social scientist and her work is examining the social and ethical issues in human and animal relationships. And she's going to talk to us about what could be on the horizon for Predator Free 2050. Please welcome Ali.
All right, kia ora everyone. As Bridget said, I'm a social scientist, I'm an anthropologist by training. I'm currently doing a 3-year postdoctoral project at the University of Auckland, which is funded by Predator Free 2050 Limited. So I did a PhD and postdoc over in the UK recently, during which I developed a specialty in ethical and social issues in human-animal, especially in conservation. And I moved back last year to start this project. So today I'm just going to give you a few brief highlights of the work that I'm doing, which is still underway, so I don't really have any results yet. So the key question I'm trying to answer is what social and ethical challenges could be on the horizon for Predator Free 2050? And also as a follow-on to that, can they actually be addressed proactively? Or is there a way we can solve them before they happen? So I'm essentially ambitiously trying to predict the future. The premise of all this is that it's all very well to think about the technical feasibility of PF 2050, but without public support, nothing can or possibly even should happen. So the methods I'm using are in-depth interviews with key informants. This is essentially done. I'm then going to use some of the themes that have emerged from this to design a large survey for the public. And I'm also going to be doing some focus groups at some stage. So I want to briefly tell you about some themes that are emerging before focusing in a little bit on tools. So first of all, one important question is the scope. Will or should it expand? This is something that's on a lot of people's minds. Either wanting it to expand or definitely not wanting it to expand. This is especially contentious, of course, around cats and also hunted animals. Private land, there's likely always someone who doesn't want to have predator control on their property, but it seems to be the case that having 100% of people on board is crucial for rat eradication specifically. So how can they be brought on board? and what do you do if you never can? So the law can be used. Under what circumstances is it ethical to do so? What proportion of the population has to be on board before you override those people's property rights? Communications, local trapping groups often use kill counts and sometimes sort of dead animal pictures. This is seen as very encouraging for some, but quite off-putting potentially for others. So essentially there's a question there around what the best approach is there. And there are quite a few different approaches currently being taken. Co-governance, that's just a note to say that Māori obviously don't just want to be consulted after the fact, after a decision's been made, even if they agree with it. And this hasn't been consistently done. So that's obviously something that's got to be sort of thought about going forward. Labour, how much can or should you ask volunteers to do? But there's also this issue of there being a perception of not enough professional trappers. Why and how that's come about is an interesting question, and also how to fix it. So that's something else that I'm thinking about. Education, international critics like Jane Goodall are concerned about getting kids involved in trapping and teaching them about predator control. But of course, that kind of work happens very widely here in New Zealand schools, and it's seen as quite an important part of getting the next generation involved in predator-free 2050. So there's questions around how this education work should be done. And finally, failure. What are the ethical implications if predator-free 2050 doesn't succeed? Many see this as still an overall net good. You've still done quite a lot of good for biodiversity, but others do ask questions about, does this mean that your cost or harm benefit analysis was based on a false premise? So you've ended up killing a lot of animals or spending a lot of money for an outcome that didn't happen. So there might be questions around that. So tools. So just thought, because this is what the session's about. So obviously, this is kind of reiterating to some extent things that we already know. The 1080 issue obviously is quite significant. It's not obvious from the work that I've been doing that this issue is going away. It's wrapped up in feelings, of course, towards science and government and elites. It's not always really about the poison itself, which is quite important to remember. And the facts don't necessarily persuade people, so it remains quite a tricky issue. Opposition to 1080 can, of course, also be about fundamental differences in values. For example, with hunters, that genuinely does threaten their hobby or even their main food source, for subsistence hunters. So that's quite important to bear in mind. That's not a science denialism issue or anything. That's really about different values. One thing that's come up a lot in relation to tools is the sort of counterintuitive outcome that Britificume is generally more publicly accepted than 1080, even though in terms of humaneness ratings and how long it stays in the environment, it is worse than 1080. So there's this push from a lot of people to see it better regulated, but then there's a couple of issues with that. So this could be happening, by the way, it's currently under review. But then that could contribute to an increasing issue whereby the available toolkit to actually achieve predator-free 2050 is ever shrinking due to increased licensing requirements. So what actually will people be able to use to achieve this? And there's also a worry that if it becomes more restricted, then it might increase public opposition to it because people would become aware of the issues with it. Other issues around tools are urban residents may find it trapping particularly confronting. High humaneness of traps can be quite persuasive, but that can only work up to a point potentially. And sometimes even NAWAC approved traps can fail on someone. So that kind of brings up questions, I think, around whether there's a need for mandatory rather than just voluntary humaneness testing of traps, and also perhaps more standardized humaneness testing. So that's an important question going forward. And then, of course, future technology, which we've already heard a bit about today. Gene drives, for example. But a thing coming up from my work is that you might need essentially social consultation before more science can happen. That's in part because the law currently limits how much research on this that can actually be done, but you potentially might need the public on board before the law can really change without people getting worried about it. So this feeds into that history of genetic engineering and so on. That can make it quite a sensitive subject. All right, I will stop there to leave some time for questions. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is going to be Jessi Morgan, and for this session we would like to welcome her back. For anyone that missed it, she is the Chief Executive of the Predator Free New Zealand Trust, and she's going to be leading us in another excellent presentation. Thanks, Jessi.
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks, Bridget. So I was just going to talk briefly about the challenges of community groups accessing tools and what issues they face. So I guess we've got this range of tools out there, and community groups are faced with this massive selection of choice. They don't necessarily know what tools to use in what situations, and what will suit, what land type they're using, the competency of their volunteers, etc. So, and how do tools compare with each other? What's the relative effectiveness of one trap over another? It's something that we don't have much research on, and we get asked that question a lot. And so something that's of interest, I think, in that space is so that we can suggest to community groups hand on heart what traps they should use given this situation. In saying that, our main advice to community groups is an overused tool gets blunt, so you need to mix up your tools for the best results. I think the other thing with tools is designing with the end user in mind. As the growth around involvement in predator free increases, we're going to have a range of users using these tools, many of which were designed for the professionals and need training. So we need to think about how we design tools with backyard users involved, farmers, etc. They have lots of different concerns and competing priorities in terms of their time. So they need to be efficient to check and clear. We need to think about NAWAC, as Ellie mentioned in the previous talk, because having an unclean kill will be unacceptable to those end users. I guess the other thing is people and groups are really keen to support the new tools that are coming on, and they're really keen to be involved in the field trials. But because funding's so hard to come by, they can't afford to fund the field trials themselves or be the guinea pigs of these new technologies as they come on board. So how do we support them to get involved with those large-scale field trials, but not make them suffer in the event that the products don't deliver what they kind of say on the box? And I think that's something we really need to think about to ensure this uptake of new technology. Otherwise, they're just going to get stuck using the same tools that we've always used, and we're not going to get any change. I talked earlier about connecting researchers with the end users. I think this is really important in terms of best practice and new tools and technology coming on the market. How can we share some of those early findings with the end users to make sure that we're keeping them engaged and motivated with their predator control? Accessing up-to-date information is really hard. So if you want to read a best practice on possum control, it's probably 15, 20 years old. And so how do we actually supply up-to-date information to these groups? And then finally, I guess the maintenance of existing tools and networks. There's no good having kit out there that's not doing anything. So how can we provide that expertise to groups for someone to come through and do that health check for them, to help them make their predator control as effective as possible? They don't want to waste their time. That's the last thing. That's how we're going to lose people from this movement. So how can we provide some guidance or some health checks on the ground for people to ensure that their trap network is as effective as possible? Last thought is just around monitoring in terms of monitoring outcomes. It's really hard, and community groups find that the thing they probably want to do least. So how can we support that to happen so we can prove results, improve outcomes from predator control? It's something that I don't think gets enough attention, and we probably should think about tools and tech in that space too. That's it from me.
Okay. Thanks to all of our speakers, and we're now going to just hop into the panel session. So again, if you do have any questions, you can just pop them into the chat feature there. And our first question is for Chris. Does your model include defence costs after eradication? Also, with afforestation, are we creating environments where pests can move or grow into?
Gosh, that's quite a contrast.
It's a complex question. Do you need me to repeat it?
First answer is no. It gets to the point of eradication only. It's a completely different scenario, and you'd probably distribute your devices and your effort in a completely different way to prevent reinvasion. That's the first thing. So it would allow users to get to the point of predicting the probability of eradication in the first case, in the first thing. There is a very big debate around what happens next, which is probably wider than this session, and whether or not it's cost effective to continually control in certain areas as opposed to try and eradicate over larger areas. So I probably better park that one for now. Afforestation and habitat change, that again is very, very complex, but I suspect that some of the new modeling approaches that are at landscape scale that are probably going to be developed over the next 2 to 5 years will allow for predictions of the effects of habitat change at a large landscape scale. Afforestation, well, you're going to get sort of different pest guilds depending on which habitat you're supporting. Forests clearly support more rats and possibly stoats, etc., whereas more open habitats, you're going to get cats because you'll get more rabbits and their prey. So you're talking about probably slightly different predator guilds depending on the habitat change over time.
Cool. Thanks for that. And just while we wait for a couple more questions to come in, because I can tell everyone's thinking very furiously about those really interesting talks, I did have one for Ellie, and something I picked up on in your talk was that we had this sort of idea that when we, part of these community groups, that when we catch these things and when we do post these pictures on social media, and you're right, they can be quite confronting. So just in some of the work you do you have any suggestions perhaps for how people can sort of maintain that sense of achievement and share these things socially and connect to that community and build that community, but maybe without some of those more delightful pictures?
To be honest, I'm not a communications expert, so I suspect Jessi might be able to have some more concrete suggestions than me. But I will say that it's a slightly tricky problem because the benefits that some people do see in the sort of slightly gruesome pictures are that it gives a sense of achievement. For a group that's actually quite accustomed to doing this, people don't necessarily find it too confronting, so it's not off-putting. It's then I think that the question really comes around, is that to some extent limiting who's in your group to some extent? Because if you're trying to reach out to a wider audience that includes people who are maybe not so keen on that, then that could be where the issue comes. So I think a lot of people have a lot of success with that kind of thing when it's working within a relatively, a circle that's quite comfortable with that. But then, one thing I have noticed is that there's a bit of a contrast, I guess, between the local community groups that are sharing these sorts of pictures within, as I said, quite a community of people that are quite accustomed to this versus a kind of more national level kind of group like Predator Free 2050 Trust and so on. These larger level groups would probably be more aimed, I assume this is right, Jessi, in bringing in a wider number of people, in which case it's more about outcomes. So that's the other sort of way of thinking about this is trying to get people enthused about birds coming back and so on. The issue, of course, with that is that can take a while. So, you might have to wait some time before you have sort of nice pictures of birds to show instead of your dead rats.
Sure. We do have a couple of other questions, but Jessi, I'll just invite you to comment on that if you would like. Anything you would like to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, Ellie's actually should be a communications expert because she nailed it. But yeah, that's totally right. And actually, the sharing of dead animals is this kind of taps into our competitive nature in the gamification. So it's that fine balance of people love to share what they've achieved, Predator-free Miramar is a good example where that's transitioned from that type of thing to sharing the outcome, more of the outcome stuff. So definitely a bit of a balance, but we definitely focus on the outcome more than the dead animals.
Great. Here's another question for Chris. With academic resources rapidly falling behind, what's being accomplished on the ground? How will the model keep relevant?
It'll be updated with new technologies coming in. Where we get a new trap that is incorporated into widespread use, it has the ability to incorporate those changes.
Great. And Ellie, another question for you. We have regarding gene editing for pest control. Any comment on whether it would help the national discussion to introduce a bill into Parliament and allow public debate, consultation to play out through that process?
That's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if I'm in the best position to answer whether people are ready for that yet or not. I think there's a potential risk that actually putting it, a draft law before people could be too soon. But at the same time, as I kind of hinted, it sounds to me as if it is kind of necessary for the science to proceed, for the law to actually change. There's a kind of interesting chicken and egg thing that's happening where you need the law to change, you need the science to develop, and you also need to bring people on board. As to the order in which that happens, I'm not totally sure. I mean, as a social scientist, I might be inclined to say, well, the social side's most important, so you should, go out and consult and talk with people and get them used to the idea before you change the law. However, it can work the other way around sometimes. If you introduce a law, people can get quite comfortable with it retrospectively. So I feel like you might need to talk to a legal expert about that.
For sure. And on this idea of public opinion or ethical issues, have we had anything that's come up sort of regarding some of our new novel tools to do, mainly with mammalian pest management? For example, the use of artificial intelligence or AI. Are we hearing anything about that? Chris, you might be able to comment about that as well.
I probably could, but I didn't hear your question because unfortunately the producer was speaking. You're asking about AI? Or...
The question was, do we have any sort of public opinion, or are there any ethical issues that are sort of being raised at the moment with regards to some of the novel tools for mammalian predator control? And I know AI is something that's being looked at very seriously for predator identification and for traps and that sort of thing. So just wondering that for Ellie, but I know you work in that space as well. So again, opening the floor to anyone who wants to comment.
Well, we're working in the AI space, not that we're developing it. We're looking with developers about, for example, identifying pests and deploying appropriate lures or control technologies. There is a move in the partner challenge to this, is the Science for Technological Innovation, SIFTI challenge, to be able to deploy units that can detect predators in places where you otherwise couldn't get to. And I've heard of nothing beyond the sort of general media stuff. We don't want killer robots in our countryside, which is fair enough. But I think the current thoughts around AI are simply about detecting animals, identifying species, and deploying an appropriate lure, or, for example, setting off a trap. Ali, have you heard anything beyond that in your work?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, essentially, so AI specifically, yeah, it's the worry, I think, is that somehow it will be perceived as Terminator type stuff. Although, interestingly, I mean, when you think about what's actually being proposed, like the Cacophony project, for example, what they're essentially planning to do is to simply have discriminatory traps rather than non-discriminatory traps. So it's actually less kind of indiscriminate robot goes around killing stuff than our current traps to some extent. So in a way, however, the public perception might not go that way. So there is that risk, I think, of trying to make it quite clear what the technology is actually doing, and also having some human involvement could help with that. So, for example, if you have a situation where a human has to confirm, yes, okay, go ahead and kill this. In the case of, say, a cat, if a cat's been detected, maybe a human has to confirm that it is in fact a feral cat before anything's killed. So I think that kind of thing, having some sort of human involvement, could help with that. I was going to say, in terms of AI stuff, the other one is drones for monitoring and that kind of thing. And I think the big issue around that is privacy. If people feel like they're being spied on in some way. So that's the risk there, I think.
And I think we are just about to wrap up. There are a couple of other questions, and I would really invite our presenters to maybe jump into the chat and ask those questions if you could post them into the discussion forum. And just in the very last minute, I'm going to just do a quick fire to our presenters. The one pest out of all of our pests that you would like to see gone, if you can name it in one sentence, why? Would anyone like to go first?
I'll go first.
Terrific.
Chris knows exactly what I'm going to say. Feral cats, I think they're left out of the predator-free vision for reasons of public support, and I think they're hugely damaging across our landscape, increasing with climate change, and we don't know enough about them. So
great. Feral cats. Who we got next? Ellie, who are we after?
Oh, I was actually going to claim, I'm sorry, I'm a social scientist and I'm not meant to have opinions about this kind of thing. So I'll pass.
Fear will defer to Chris.
I was going to go right-wing politicians, but I'll be slightly less inflammatory. I'll go with cats as well. I think they're completely underestimated in terms of their impact.
Very good. We've heard it here first, and I think on that note we might come back to you, Tama, and you can introduce our next speaker. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Ellie, you were good at dodging questions. You keep saying that you're a social scientist, but I love it. And I would have probably gone with rat if anyone wanted to know. Anyway, our next speaker, ka tahuri atu tātou ki tēnei mea te mano te tai ao. Ināia nei, te wahanga ki a tātou, katoa. We now have Sam Rowland from Department of Conservation to talk about te mano te tai ao, Aotearoa New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy. She's a Principal Strategy Implementation Advisor at the Department of Conservation, and she's worked in government and community conservation initiatives, protecting both threatened invertebrates and plants. Sam, over to you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Sam Rowland toka Whenua. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today to talk to you about the implementation of Te Mana o Te Taio. So the strategy itself provides the common thread connecting the work needed to protect and restore biodiversity across New Zealand now and into the future. Its vision is Te Mauri Heke Heke o Te Taio, the life force of nature is vibrant and vigorous. And to achieve this, how we implement the strategy now and into the next 30 years matters. Te Mana o Te Taio acknowledges that everyone who lives in Aotearoa New Zealand has a part to play in helping to restore the Mauri of nature for future generations. This is a shared strategy for all New Zealanders, including whānau hapu iwi, central local government, community and businesses. Te Mana o Te Taio contains key messages that's crucial to keep front of mind as we go on our implementation journey. Transformational change is required. It recognises that Aotearoa is in a biodiversity crisis and a fundamental shift to our systems and way of working is required. It has 3 po or pillars with 96 goals that provide the direction and focus towards the transformational change we need to see between now and 2050, apologies. These po are tuapapa, getting the system right, whakaho, empowering action, te aki me te whakaho manu, protecting and restoring. The strategy explicitly calls out the need to erase the disconnect between people, nature, and the economy. It's also our first biodiversity strategy containing the how, those getting the system right, and empowering action po, as well as the what, the protecting and restoring po. It's saying to us, unless you have the systems right, such as centralised governance, te ao Māori, as well as sound monitoring and reporting systems, you're not actually achieving the impact that we need. It also tests us to think about what really needs to be done to enable the entire population to participate. Māori are central to the biodiversity system and recognised as leaders. This is all about mātauranga Māori, ensuring that the relationship between Crown and Māori is reflected throughout all aspects. And what do Māori see as true expressions of giving effect to kaitiakitanga and rangatiratanga? We're not starting from scratch in many of these areas, but there is significant effort required to create the change we need. This diagram is showing that everyone in Aotearoa, New Zealand has a part to play in helping restore the mauri of nature for future generations. At the heart, it shows Te Mana o Te Tau is centred on Māori Crown partnership. Tangata whenua have a special and critical role in nurturing and enhancing biodiversity. The next layer is all about delivery by central and local government. This recognises their statutory responsibilities to deliver on ANZBS, the need to align their work programs, and the commitment needed to getting the systems right. Other groups, the whole of New Zealand, play an important role and can contribute to this future in diverse ways. This is the implementation cycle. We're still in the early stages of the journey around how we build each component to implement the strategy, and there is a lot of uncertainty in all of these areas. We do know that this is the Conservation Minister's biggest priority, and we are motivated to capture momentum. The whole cycle enables us to deliver effective and priority actions to address biodiversity issues. It highlights the need for collaboration, national, local, and regional actions, sound monitoring and reporting, and decisions based on using knowledge systems, both Māori and science. The cycle's timeframe from start to finish is 5 years, although in this first 5 years, we will complete this twice. DOC is leading the first stages of implementation on behalf of the wider biodiversity system. We are focusing on building the foundations for implementation, so progressing the work to establish the systems and processes for governance and coordination. So what are we currently doing to build those foundations? In April, the first implementation plan for Te Mana o Te Tau was launched. It is the first time key conservation activities across government departments and councils have been identified in an action plan to protect biodiversity. Our immediate focus with this iteration was on establishing systems that would stimulate and sustain nationwide action. But we do know that this is not a fully fledged implementation plan in the essence of what the strategy wanted. There is a lot of work that still needs to be done to get this right. The current plan is a living document, so the next update will include actions from iwi hapu whānau, NGOs, conservation groups, businesses, and private landowners that all contribute to meeting the goals of ANZBS. We also know for the next plan, we at least need to ensure there's a focus on effective and priority actions, governance, and sound monitoring and reporting systems. We have started work on prioritising and simplifying ANZBS by creating tools and frameworks to focus implementation. We are keeping track of New Zealand's international obligations under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. Having a strategy and an implementation plan for biodiversity is part of New Zealand's commitments under this convention. When it is ratified near the end of this year, we will assess and prioritise the strategy's 2025 and 2030 goals and reflect these into implementation plans. We have started to scope to develop the structures and channels needed for future action planning and strategy implementation, with a hope to start this in a structured way post-July this year. This work is vital if the next implementation plan is to be a true sector-wide version. On top of this, we are also working with an external independent group who are providing recommendations for what system-wide governance looks like over implementation. This work is on track to be delivered to DOC's Director General in 2022, following which a decision will be made on the scope, structure, and setup for both long-term and interim governance arrangements. And lastly, we are developing 2 measurement systems: the assurance system, which will ensure actions from the implementation plan are on track for delivering and subject to regular performance reporting, and the monitoring system, which will measure outcomes from the strategy, tracking how the biodiversity has improved as a result. This second part of the work is led by both DOC and Manaaki Whenua Landcare research and will consist of both Western science and Mātauranga Māori indicators. Both the assurance and the outcomes measurement systems ensure decisions are based on evidence, including Mātauranga Māori and science, as well as providing transparent monitoring on progress to all. There is still significant work to undertake in the implementation of the strategy. Taking the strategy of the implementation at this our work, and we're looking forward to connect with you all in the future to ensure the Māori of nature is vibrant and vigorous for future generations. Kia ora.
Sam, thank you for that. And having been involved in Te Mana Te Taio myself, I know it is a big and complex strategy. How do you keep across it all? There's so many different parts to it and so many different agents, actors or players within it. Yeah, do you keep across it all?
I try my best, yes, to keep across it all. I think the main point for us is just having clear focuses on where we're heading. And at the moment, we're sitting very much in those building the foundation sort of areas. So that's where we're focusing on, laying those foundations, learning from the mistakes in the past strategy to help move us forward.
Nice. Anything we can look forward to? So, as I said, I've been involved in this for quite a while now, but I'd like everyone else to sort of know about it. And if they don't know, they don't know. What's the next big win in the implementation or the planning of this that we can share with everyone?
Yeah, the next big win, well, there's probably a couple of them from my opinion. The next one will be the governance. So getting that advice on the interim and long-term governance through to DOC's Director General. That's going to be a big step for us and going to help pave the way and help DOC move out of its current system leads role and transition into just being a delivery agent and actually empowering the whole sector to take lead, which will be great. And by sector, I mean everyone in the biodiversity system. The next thing is definitely the monitoring and reporting work that's led by both DOC and Manaaki Whenua, and there's some really good wins coming out of that with a lot of agency collaboration and wānanga as well with the Mātauranga Māori component of the work.
Kia ora. I was fortunate enough to be at one of those wānanga for the monitoring phase, and yeah, there's so much that I'd like everyone to know about, so that's why I asked the next big wins. But thank you so much for sharing your kōrero with us and sharing your time with us, and we look forward to anything that comes out of Te Mana Te Taio. Nā re tēnā koe.
Kia ora, thank you. Look forward to connecting with you all in the future.
Cheers. Nō reira tātou mā, ko tai ki te otinga o tēnei rā, o tira te otinga o tēnei wahanga o te wānanga. We've come to the end of our day with a few minutes to spare. So before we close up, I just want to thank again all of our speakers from today. It feels like it's been a long day, but that's because my brain is full of so much knowledge, and I think I've filled up half of my notepad with notes. Luckily, I know a few of the speakers' email addresses, so I'm going to be pestering them for the next few hours. But again, thank you to anyone that spoke today, and to those who watched and sent through questions. Big mihi to you. As I said, if you're thinking it, everyone else is thinking it, and it helps sort of pull apart or build on the ideas that are shared when people ask questions. Reira ka mihi ki a koutou, I whai wā ki te hono mai, ki te tuku pātai mai, ki te wānanga, I ene mea rawe ki wanginu a tātou katoa. Before we do close up, again, thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back again tomorrow at 10 o'clock. In the meantime, don't forget about those prizes up for grabs. Click on the Win Points button to get involved. And if you did like some of the speakers, I'm sure you'll be able to find their email addresses as well and pester them like I will be doing. So with that, I'll close our wānanga and enjoy the rest of your night, and hopefully see you back here at Pōpō. Nō reira, tēnei tātou, ko tukuna ngā whakaaro ki te whai tata, tēnei hoki tātou, ko tukuna ngā whakaaro ki te whai tawhiti, hoki wairua mai ki a tātou, e rongo whakairi ake ki runga, tūturu whakamaua ki a tīna, haumie huie, tai ki e.